Welcome to Lesson 20, Memory and External Cognition. In this lesson, we draw a lot from Ed Hutchinson's book, Cognition in the Wild, and I highly recommend taking a look at it. By the end of this lecture, you'll be able to describe implications of memory on user interfaces, provide examples of elements of external cognition, critique and suggest improvements to an interface using implications of memory and external cognition. So let's talk about cognition again. As you'll recall from the previous lesson, cognition is what goes on in the mind, and it involves a lot of different activities. We talked about some cognitive processes last time, it's specifically attention and perception, and today we'll be focusing on memory and a little bit of problem solving, planning, and etc. So we'll start with memory. Memory involves encoding and then retrieving knowledge. We don't remember everything. We actually construct memories depending on what we attend to and influence them when we recall them, which means that context is really important in affecting our memory. So where you are, when you are, how you were feeling, what you're smelling at the time possibly, all of this plays an influence in how that memory is encoded and whether we can recall it later. We can recognize things much better than being able to recall things. Remember when someone says, hey, remember when this happened? You say, oh yeah, I remember that. But to actually recall that out of nowhere can be a lot more challenging. Or your passwords, right? If someone gives you a list of 3 passwords, you could probably select the one that you've used in the past. But being able to recall it out of nowhere is much more challenging. And we're better at remembering images than words. This is part of why interfaces are largely visual. You can get even better remembrance if you have multiple encodings, if you have it encoded with multiple senses. That tends to reinforce memory. Early theories of memory postulated 2 separate types of memory, long-term memory and short-term or working memory. And this is very useful for us when designing interfaces. We're going to go with an example. Take 30 seconds, pause the video if you have to memorize this number and be ready to write it down when I say go. Okay, so take 30 seconds. I'll actually count for you. That's 10 seconds. You have 20 more. Go. Write it down. Pause the video if you need to. Okay, I'm about to reveal it. How much did you get right? Let's try this again. Take 30 seconds to memorize this number and be ready to write it down when I say go. I'll start counting now. That's 10 seconds. And go. Write it down. Pause the video if you have to. All right, I'm about to reveal the number. How much did you get this time? The reason you might have gotten more the second time is because there are different chunks of information. So it allows you to maybe recognize patterns and reuse those while trying to memorize it. This is an example of working memory. Short-term memory has been demonstrated to have finite capacity, often known as 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information, have finite duration, it decays after 2 or even 3 seconds. It's volatile, it's easily overwritten by new information. This is why you need other people to be quiet when you're trying to memorize something for just for a second if you're trying to write down something that you're trying to remember. And the capacity can be increased by pattern building or encoding. Here, we're using one technique, which is chunking. We're grouping information into these chunks, and you just have to memorize those different chunks of information. Now, we had a very specific number, 7 plus or minus 2, on the last slide. A classic study by Miller in 1956 showed that working memory can only remember 5 to 9 items. And this has had a lot of influence on interface design. And one common interpretation that people might think is that this means that menus should have 7 items. What do you think? Should menus have 7 items based on this finding? No. This is how many chunks that we actually remember. This is not how many you can select from a list or how easily it is to go through. It has very different implications. So what does this result mean? It means, first of all, that we should minimize how much the user has to keep in their head. If we're requiring them to remember a super long number that has 20 or 30 chunks, they're not going to be able to do that. They're going to have to stage it or use some sort of memory aid. And if you need them to store something, for example, you send some information to them, for example, something like a CAPTCHA or a two-factor authentication, you want to keep it to 7 chunks or so that people, if they're using multiple devices and they're going from one to the other, they don't have to remember more than 5 to 9 chunks of information. We've already talked about recognition versus recall. This is why a multiple choice test is easier than an essay test. Because in multiple choice, you can recognize the answer. Now, I personally find multiple choice tests quite a bit harder than essays sometimes because they can be very tricky. But if you're just looking for recalling information and presenting it, then in this case, it's much easier. With an essay, you must recall the answer. A computer with a graphical user interface that allows us to recognize commands on the menu instead of recalling them, such as DOS and Unix, like a command line, means that it's much easier to recognize what you're able to do and say, oh yeah, in Photoshop, I know there's oh yeah, that's what the command I want. I want context-aware rescaling or whatever. And often you can't remember that. If you had to type that in as a command line, you need to really commit that to memory. And there's more information from our good friends, the NN group, if you want to take a look deeper into this. You've probably seen examples of recognition over recall before. For example, in GUIs, which allows you to recognize anything graphical. As I recall, graphics are easier to remember. Recent lists, so you can quickly look and say, oh yeah, that was the name of the file. Autocomplete, which is super valuable, especially for programming or searching, etc. One other influence in memory is how much you process it. The more attention that's paid to something, the more it's processed in terms of thinking about it and comparing with other knowledge, the more likely it is to be remembered. I used to sketchnote, take notes of a presentation or a talk by creating a sketch that ends up structuring the talk. And this was really, really valuable because it both structured the information. I had to pay attention to, how are they talking about the topic? Are they putting into a 3-part story? Are they kind of wandering around and giving different anecdotes? Are they building to one central idea? And then I'd have to lay that out on a page. And what this let me do is not only was it easier to remember things down the line because I spent the time processing it, but when I flipped through my notebook, I knew exactly what each talk was because I just visually saw it and was remembered or recalled all this information. This is the human processor model. This is one model of cognition where everything is stored in our head, right? You've got a perceptual unit, you've got a motor processor, you've got a cognitive processor, and it's doing all this manipulation of the incoming stimuli. But remember, cognition is what goes on in our mind, not necessarily what goes on in our brain. So does thought just occur in our heads? This leads us to external cognition. And I'm going to talk about a different term, distributed cognition, or DCOG, which is related to external cognition. Ed Hutchins is a cognitive anthropologist, and he developed the theory of distributed cognition while working for the US Navy. He observed how crews would analyze and solve problems as a group. So he would be on the bridge of these ships, and he'd just watch how they adapted the course and how they took incoming information. And it's hard for me to describe, but luckily I managed to get some footage of the event.
Report, Lieutenant.
That beam is draining our shields.
If they pull down our shields, we're helpless.
Warp 8, any heading? Engage.
Captain, the beam is holding us here.
Increase the power.
Shields weakening.
Shields will be down in 18 seconds.
Locate the exact source of that tractor beam. Lock on phasers.
Phasers locked on target.
Fire.
That reminds me, I should watch the new Picard. So when I was reading Ed Hutchins' book, the introduction really felt like it was something out of Star Trek. You've got people talking what they're doing. Yes, I'm scanning this. There's no effect from the scanners, or the shields aren't holding, and that information gets passed around from person to person and through the ship out to people. So for example, in a smaller cockpit, you have propagation of representational states going through these different people and through the system. The air traffic controller might give clearance to a pilot to fly to a higher altitude. This is verbal communication. The pilot changes the altitude meter, which is both mental, you think about it in their head, and physical. So they change the altitude meter. The captain observes the pilot, so this is visual information, and the captain flies to a higher altitude, which is mental and physical information. So this information is really transferring through people and through the machines, all of it together. And so cognition is actually happening distributed amongst all these different agents. So the way you might think of the traditional model is you've got a brain that has inputs, sensory inputs. There are processes going on in the head, in the brain, and then outputs, which is motor behavior. But you might also view this as a distributed model, where you have multiple inputs coming in from both to systems and to people. It transfers across these different agents and these different parts of the system, and then there's multiple outputs. One tenet of distributed cognition is external cognition. So cognition is distributed across people, artifacts, and environments. And one feature of decog is that cognition is not just internal, i.e. in our brains, but external. And there's three ways that we could use external cognition to improve a system. One is externalizing to reduce memory load. The second is computational offloading. And the third we'll talk about is annotation and cognitive tracing. So first, we'll talk about externalizing to reduce memory load. So first, take 2 minutes to think about examples of memory aids you use, technological or otherwise. Pause the video, just write them down, see what you can come up with. Go. So examples of externalizing memory might be whether to do something, so a to-do alert, when to do something, so calendar or deadlines, and what to do, notes that are collocated with a reminder. If you've ever put something on a post-it note and put it on your screen, that's externalizing your memory. And today I had to call the garage to fix my car, and I set an alert on my phone. Again, externalizing it, get everything out into the world so that you don't have to keep it in your head. The second way we can use external cognition is through computational offloading. We'll do another interactive example, and just do this in real time in the video. Multiply the following numbers in your head. Okay. Pause the video if you need to. Okay, now use a pen and paper to do this multiplication. You can pause. Okay, now you can pause again. Use the calculator to do this multiplication. Go. And that's computational offloading. You use external tools to aid you in producing these computations. There's not just you working, it's you and the pen and the pencil, or it's you and the calculator accomplishing this task. The third use of external cognition is annotation and cognitive tracing. And this is modifying external representations to reflect changes. So for example, if you have a shopping list, you might go to the store, you grab bread, so you cross that off, and then you see fruit and you think, oh, none of the fruit here is very good. So you highlight it because you know that you're going to have to revisit that later when you go to a different store or do a different trip. And then you see that milk is not crossed out, so you go and do that. When you find the milk, you cross it off as well. So now take 2 minutes. This one will be on Learn. Follow the instructions on Learn to suggest ideas for cognitive tracing in everyday life or existing interfaces. Go for it. So my examples for this are an email client. I mark things as unread or I snooze emails all the time so that I can revisit them when it makes sense for me to do so. That's changing the environment based on what I want, when I want to accomplish these tasks. Or highlighting criticisms in a PDF. I kind of highlight things, which means when I come back, I'm like, oh yeah, that was something I didn't like about this paper that I want to revisit. Or the assignment draft was looking okay, but right here is a problem. I'm going to tackle that when I have more time. So the key takeaways from this lesson are memory is a resource. You want to know its limitations and you want to know how to reduce cognitive load or improve recollection. And cognition happens across people and systems. There are 3 key ways to leverage this in interfaces: externalizing memory, offloading computation, and exploiting annotation. These facts can be used to critique or design interfaces, and you'll use these in assignment 5. That's it for now. Thank you so much. I'll see you next time.